Welcome to Church Without Walls. I'm John Kirkwood, and it's been a minute. It's been a beat. I just wanted to jump on for a few minutes this morning because I don't have a lot to say. It's been a chaotic weekend, and I thought it might be good to just get on to say I'm still here, and we will be back more regularly. We've had a lot going on in our personal lives lately. Keep me off screen, but I didn't want to go too long without getting back on and letting you know I'm still here, and I know you are. So, just a couple comments about the craziness that we're living in right now after this. I used to be someone who was really wrapped up into politics and world news and followed all the pages and kept up with all the news and I kind of have an obsessive personality. So whether it's the NFL or the WNBA or the Comanche Indians or serial killers or any other of my pursuits and hobbies, I kind of obsess about it and throw myself into it. That's just the way I am. It is hard to live with. Ask my wife, who would wake up sometimes in the night as I'm listening to a book on tape, kind of low. But it would be about the Comanche Indians or serial killers, and she'd be like, really? However, lately I haven't been given to that when it comes to politics and so forth. I have recovered, I guess you would say, from the world of Christian nationalism. I think now I'm much more enraptured with the person of Jesus Christ, his actual words and his actions, than I am the theologies that have been built up around that. Because I see that there's bias. I see that woven into some of these theologies, there's manipulation involved and so forth. And I really think to derive the full fruit of, well, some people wouldn't blanch at the idea of a relationship with Jesus, but if you are a disciple in the true tense, somebody who admires the teachings of Jesus and you want to follow him, or maybe you're just intrigued by the person, I think we're better off actually, kind of centering or focusing around the person than on people who are more than willing to tell you what he really meant. So I've kind of been out of that world, and yet sometimes you get dragged back in, especially in an election year. And I know there's a lot of people that are experiencing anxiety over the election year, over Joe Biden's mental state. And I'm not trying to be critical here or trying to be mean or anything. I'll witness the debate as you did, and it did remind me of my elderly parents who have both passed, rest their souls. And I love my elderly parents deeply, but and I'm not going to make any further comments on this really, other than to say that was a real sense of anxiety that fomented among Democrats to see their leading candidate in such an important election seem to really have a hard time at a debate, and it seemed to reveal something that's really not fixable, that you can't grow back. And then that was kind of exciting to people on the other side of the aisle, because the person they're running against is weaker, and they were doing everything in their power to keep the status quo, and including suggesting they might sue if the Democrats replace him. And some people in polls, more Republicans wanted Joe Biden to stay in the race than Democrats. So there was an excitement there on the other side of the aisle. And then comes yesterday, where there was an assassination attempt on the Republican candidate, former President Donald J. Trump. And thank God that that was a not successful attempt, and that's all being sorted out right now. But it seemed to really, oh wow, I know it made some people feel. I've talked to some people like this is a really dark period in our country, and it is. It's hard to suggest it's not. Donald Trump has, in a way, divided the party, divided the country, divided families. And I'm not saying this merely critically. I know Donald Trump supporters who would admit to that. And they would point to a verse from Jesus said, I come not to bring peace, but a sword, and to divide, mother and father from daughter and son and daughter-in-law and all that. And they're proud of it in a way. And yet there is this giant cloud over our country lately. I just want to say a few things about that, because there is chaos going on right now. I do want to say a few things about a sense of calm that you could find in the midst of chaos. And I'm not suggesting that we could be so content in the midst of chaos that we could be asleep in the boat like Jesus, right? There's this story of Jesus in a fishing boat with his disciples, and there's a storm that is so bad, so extreme, it scares the fishermen. So that tells you, fishermen are some of the bravest, most courageous people at sea that you're going to meet. And in the story, at least, the storm is so severe that the fishermen are fearing for their lives, and they wake up the carpenter, right? Who's asleep in the boat and completely content, and he's Lord of the storm, so he calms the storm. There's a metaphor there for us as well. But I've talked to a number of people, and they think this is a really dark period in our country's history. I just want to point out that it's not the darkest. And I do think that's important, because I think every generation lives in extremes. Every generation thinks that they're smarter than every previous generation, or more righteous, or more civilized. And in some ways, they are, or we are. We've grown beyond certain things. Slavery is no longer considered a norm or something that could be healthy. So we have grown beyond previous generations' weaknesses and flaws, but maybe not so much their strengths or their gifts. But I had a dear friend recently say to me that he preferred the 60s, where people were more about peace and love. And at first I misunderstood him. I'm like, wait a minute. I'm like, yeah, that's true, but the 60s also were the period that saw the assassinations of John F. Kennedy and Robert Kennedy and Martin Luther King Jr., and it saw the Weather Underground. So there were domestic terrorists, there were race riots, there was a horrible race problem, there was the embroilment of the Vietnam War, which leads into Watergate. There were all kinds I know Watergate was 70s, but there were all kinds of things in the 60s that were pretty chaotic, that were pretty turmoil. And then my friend corrected me, and he said, I understand all that, and that's not what I meant. But it seemed like the pursuit of the protesters was peace and love. And you do remember flower power and so forth. And so there's truth to that. You don't see that today, truly. And so I sadly misunderstood the point, but I get it too. But it's good to remember that that the previous periods of American history were deeply chaotic as well. And well, we might look back at them with fondness, or oh, those were the good old days or the golden days. Um, I think that might be more nostalgia uh, than it is, 2020 eyesight. But we have today. We don't have yesterday. We can learn from yesterday. We can be educated about yesterday. We can be entertained by yesterday. And when I say educated, we can learn from our fathers and our grandfathers' mistakes. We could celebrate their victories and cherish those and try to nurture those into our victories. That's where wisdom comes from. But we should never feel so, I think, in the throes of despair that we don't realize each generation faces their own challenges, and they may be specific to that generation. The racism of the 50s is different than the racism question of today. And I said that purposefully to let you know that there still is racism today. But it is a very different variety and kind than the racism that existed where you couldn't use a water fountain in some cases, or a restroom, or famous athletes could have their greatest moments on their field and be recognized as the greatest athletes in their field, and yet they wouldn't be able to eat with their teammates at a restaurant or stay in the same hotel as their teammates. It's a very different variety today than it was yesterday. So we do have our own unique challenges, and this election year may be unlike previous ones where the threat of violence wasn't so out front. And that could really offset your personal peace and wellness. Anxiety might grip you and take a hold on you. Now, some older people that only have Fox News on around the clock at their house, I would really encourage you to turn that off. As I would encourage anyone who obsesses about news so much that they have it on 24/7, because what bleeds leads, and you're going to be an emotional train wreck if that's all you do. I love Marc Chagall's philosophy even more than I do his art, but Chagall famously would take his paintings and put them up next to a tree, and if they somehow clashed with nature, he'd throw them out. He knew he had to do something else, because he knew his artwork shouldn't clash with the greatest artists, right? But the one thing I love about Chagall is he had this kind of personal principle that he lived by, and that is, he believed, and I don't know the exact quote, but it was basically like, never go to bed without considering something beautiful. And of course he was a visual artist, but he didn't just mean paintings. He didn't just mean look at a painting before you go to bed. He might have included in that sentiment the idea of reading a poem, a beautiful poem, or putting on a beautiful piece of music. Some people have Alexa play ocean waves or nature sounds, or they'll have Alexa play a nighttime playlist that leads them into sleep. And some people will put away their phones and screens and iPods and iPads, forgive me, a couple hours before bed because they don't want to get wound up and so forth. And I do think there's something to that. There's not only an effectiveness, there's a majesty to doing that. And yet there are times that we need to do that, not just at night when we're going to bed, but if you feel yourself getting anxious and getting worked up over the day's news or the current politic or events that are taking place in your own country, around the world, then you're probably, it's probably time to just breathe. Which, by the way, I took as part of the title today, and I've already gone on longer than I would have liked, but I want to share that with you and talk about it just for a second. Let me do it here. Let's go to write, and let's pick that, and that'll work. And here we go. So let me merge that and just, this is embarrassing for me to admit, because when I think of the lyrics for Just Breathe, I think of Eddie Vedder and Pearl Jam's song Just Breathe. Although that's about the death of a friend. And I love Anna Nellick's version of Just Breathe. And yet here I'm quoting some contemporary Christian, Johnny Diaz, who I don't even listen to, just because this one refrain in his song Just Breathe really caught my attention, and it really encapsulates what I wanted to say today. He writes and he sings, "Breathe, just breathe, come and rest at my feet and be, just be. Chaos calls, but all you really need is to just breathe." This happens, by the way, Wendy and I were watching just a beautiful movie last night about a father, really about a family with an autistic child, and it's called Ezra. And it's got wonderful actors in it. It's wonderfully written. It's an inspirational story. The writer of the movie has an autistic child, and he was writing about it, and that's why he wanted to make this movie. But there are a number of moments in the movie where each parent, the father and the mother, who are going through a divorce, try and calm their child. The child gets upset and starts to visibly lose it, starts to panic and have a tantrum or an episode. And there are certain ways that the parent calms the child, helps to calm the child and bring him back to just breathe. And whether it's rubbing an earlobe or gently actually taking a hairbrush, and gently stroking the child's back. There are different ways they have of trying to help produce calm, trying to help their child, their loved one, get to a place of calm and get out of that jail cell of chaos that they're experiencing at the moment, whether it's from some kind of sensory thing, a sound, or raised voices, or a metal fork, or different things, or uncomfortable social interactions that make the awkwardness turn into an episode. And the parents are doing this out of love, and of course, soothing, being around people who are soothing is a good thing, or things that bring you that can bring you back to calm. And it's wonderful when those things are more than sensory things, when they're more than gentle music or a beautiful painting or a lovely verse that means much to you that you have highlighted in your Bible. Or it's just wonderful when that connection might be your pet, your dog, your daily companion, or even more so when that person is a human being that you connect with and who recognizes that at that moment you might not be at your best or not be in a good place, and they're willing to make themselves vulnerable, maybe even the target of your flailing. They're willing to intercede at their own cost, and there may be a cost, to bring you peace. And oftentimes it begins with reminding us to just breathe. Often that elusive contentment is more accessible, when we slow down, when we turn off, when we noise silence those things that are upsetting us for the moment and just concentrate on something as fundamental, as elemental as just breathing. If you are a person who can do that, now I'm going to recommend this movie is called Ezra. Just go out. We bought it online on Prime because renting it was only $5 difference. And we gambled on this being a special movie just by the trailer that we're going to want our kids to watch and that we're going to want to share with friends. So we bought it. And I got to tell you, it's worth it. But there's this wonderful scene in the movie, and I'm not going to ruin it for you. This isn't a spoiler. But where a young girl has this remarkable effect on Ezra, on Ezzy, the autistic child. And she is able to have an effect on him greater even than his parents, who for years have been trying to affect him in certain ways. And she's able to do it in hours, in what they have failed to do in years. And there's a magic there that I'm still trying to figure out. But there is an effect that kids have on our kids, or peers have on us, that our parents or those close to us just can't have. We don't allow them to have it, even though they might be sharing the same wisdom. But so I don't want to get into the scene specifics, because I do want you to watch this movie. But it was very meaningful for Wendy and I. That was the beauty we saw last night. We were both upset at what happened at this attempted assassination and this whole embroilment that our country is in, where there's just such a hatred of one side for the other, and it's mutual in many cases. And it's bothersome because Joe Biden and Donald Trump are both old, and they're going to pass into oblivion and into the history books, and yet their supporters remain behind. And it's just troubling to see the divide to be so distinct between Americans. I will admit to you, I did not, and in the moment, how do you judge a person? But I did not think it's a positive thing to raise your fist in the air and yell, fight, 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 from the stage there. I mean, that certainly shows, I guess, courage and bravery, but I think it also shows anger and resentment. And I'm not sure that that's something, I know the way Reagan reacted was probably very different than what's going to happen in the next few days. And I don't want to get distracted there, but I just want to say to you, don't allow, and this is really, I taught the book of Philippians for 6 years when I was a pastor. I know, that's crazy. 4 chapters, 6 years. But Philippians really is about, as Warren Wiersbe pointed out, the thieves of joy. That there are certain things that we as human beings, if we're distracted or if we're uninformed about the psychology of these things, that we allow into our home to steal our joy. And Wiersbe takes each chapter and he says, in this chapter, other people can steal our joy. And in this chapter, circumstances can steal our joy. And in this chapter, worry or anxiety can be a thief of joy. And he does this for all 4 chapters. And certainly all those things can steal our joy. In this case, we're talking about anxiety. But I want to share with you one of my favorite passages from that book. And my mom, this was her favorite passage, I think, in all of the Bible. And oftentimes, as a child, this was the way she'd rub my earlobe, right? Oftentimes, as a child, I'd share with her my anxiety for certain things, circumstances, something I was going through with, or people I was having difficulty with. And she would listen, so she wouldn't cut me off. She would listen, she would even engage with me on it. And then at some point, she would bring up what Paul summarizes to the Philippians in the 4th chapter. This is from the Message Bible. Summing it all up, friends, I'd say you'll do best by filling your minds and meditating on things true. Boy, can we use that advice in a world where so-called fake news or conspiracy theories are flags that are often waved in the face of one another. Summing it all up, friends, I'd say you'll do best by filling your minds and meditating on things true, on things noble, reputable, authentic, compelling, gracious, on the very best, not the worst. Paul's not saying here don't recognize that the bad exists and the worst is out there. He's not asking us to be a fool who buries our head in the sand in ignorant bliss. He's asking us to place priority on things, and he's saying these things should have priority. Just as Chagall says, before you go to bed, right? Give priority to beauty. Give priority to things that'll make you think about how we can make life more beautiful, not only in our relationships or in our surroundings, but in the future for our children. So here, not on the worst. In contrast, not the worst, but the beautiful. Not the ugly, but things that are praiseworthy, things that are worthy of praise, not things to curse. Put into practice what you learned from me, what you heard and saw and realized. This is being written by a prisoner of Nero, awaiting trial in a hole in the ground called the Mamertine prison. This is a prisoner writing this to a church. So put into practice what you learned from me, what you heard and saw and realized. Do that. And God, who makes everything work together, will work you into his most excellent harmonies. So if you are allowing the chaos to reign, I would say, let's take this advice. And there are people in your life who this comes to more naturally, right? And recognize them and maybe follow them and maybe emulate them. What is it about them that they can stay calm in situations where most of us are running around like chickens with our heads cut off? This is an admirable thing. This is something that is recognized, not only on the military field. There's a great story that I love. My oldest son's middle name is MacArthur, named after Douglas, the general from World War II. But there's a story I love because I'm a big fan of Patton as well. And Patton and MacArthur met each other once in World War I. And Patton, trying to make a name for himself, as was his wont, was in a battle. The name escapes me right now in World War I. And it was a hard artillery shelling going on all over the place. And he said every soldier he saw was in the foxhole taking cover. And yet people were murmuring. And And when he found out the nature of their murmuring, it's because there was an officer forward of their position looking with field glasses at the enemy positions, and he was standing upright on a hill, exposed to enemy fire, and he was taking in enemy positions so he could relay it to our own artillery. And Patton was hiding in the foxhole at the time and not wanting to be outcouraged. He had to see who this was. So he got out of his foxhole and he made his way to this forward position, and it turns out it was Douglas MacArthur. And Patton writes in his diary that he was so impressed by MacArthur, he was inspired by MacArthur's courage that he took up that same demeanor on the battlefield for about 24 hours. Because when he tried it the next day, he got shot in the ass. So I'm sorry. I love that story. And MacArthur might have done it for the wrong reason. MacArthur actually felt that, we all have our number punched on a certain day, and the Lord knows that day. And so he had a false sense of safety because he figured the Lord would protect him. And maybe there's some truth to that, but the Lord didn't cover Patton's ass the next day on that battlefield. So I think we can end with that. We can end with that. But think on these things, folks. Don't allow anxiety or circumstances or other people to steal your joy. My wife just had a moment this morning where we have a mutual person in our lives who once in a while will poke or prod her to try and get her to respond. And she is just so amazing. She's handles things in such a good way. I would get angry, or I would respond. I'd be one of those guys who's ready to respond when actually you should count to 10, take a deep breath, and realize that we're better than that. We don't have to play on that low level. And so don't allow other people to change the person you are, or at least the person, your best person, or the person God wants you to be. Don't allow other people, or don't allow anxiety. Be anxious for nothing doesn't mean that there's nothing to be anxious about. It means have control over your soul. Have the reins of your soul. Keep the horses calm, right? I mean, there's a big difference. Speaking of battle, horses that were prepared for battle had to get used to the sound, the smells, the smoke, the chaos of battle. And if you brought a horse that was uninitiated into the chaos of battle, it would throw its rider and run for safety. It lacked the discipline, the awareness of what its surroundings were going to be. And we need to be, because we're parents, because we're siblings, because there are going to be moments where we have to calm our children, but as your parents get older, there are going to be moments where they're scared, and we have to bring calm into their lives and stability and peace out of the chaos. So there are all kinds of moments where you're going to be that friend that brings wellness back to the person who's off kilter. And so I just suggest to you that just breathe can mean think on these things or prioritize these things when there's chaos all around you. If by Rudyard Kipling would be a good place to start. Thanks for joining me today, folks. We'll see you again shortly.